They nearly opened fire on him. A single P-40 came sliding out of the Assam haze toward Nagaguli with a dirty ribbon of smoke trailing from the cowling. It wasn't lined up the way a friendly fighter should be. It was too fast, too steep, coming from the wrong direction. Then, for a few impossible seconds, it rolled onto its back, landing gear hanging in the air like a broken limb. On the ground, men who'd spent months expecting Japanese raids did what the war had trained them to do. They ran for guns, swung barrels, and tried to decide in the space of a heartbeat whether this was a crippled American coming home or an enemy pilot in a captured fighter about to rake the runway. That moment only makes sense if you rewind to the exact minute the day went wrong. At 9:27 a.m. on December 13th, 1943, Second Lieutenant Philip Adair, 23 years old, was climbing over Assam, India, in his Curtiss P-40N Warhawk, nicknamed Lulu Bell, with photos painted on the airframe. He'd already flown up under 43 combat missions. And earlier that same morning, he'd been on a routine patrol, roughly 3 hours, sirs, of scanning empty sky over the supply corridor everyone simply called the Hump. In Assam, routine was never relaxed. The Hump was a logistics war fought in weather and fatigue. Transports clawing over mountains, engines icing, navigation errors turning into missing aircraft, and the constant knowledge that every crate that failed to arrive would be felt somewhere far away, as hunger, ammunition shortage, or stalled momentum. Dinjan and the surrounding airfield complex weren't just dots on a map. They were the hinges that let the whole mechanism keep moving. Adair had just landed and was barely back on the ground when the siren ripped across the base. Red alert, sir. He sprinted something like 100 feet dive to his fighter. His crew chief hit an electric starter. Adair had fought to acquire for exactly this reason, and the Allison engine was already alive by the time Adair climbed in. He didn't stop to fetch a parachute. He didn't waste time settling into comfort. He shoved the throttle forward and was airborne in well under a minute, climbing into a sky that looked calm enough to lie to you. The standard plan on alert was simple. Climb and rendezvous over the field at about 20,000 feet. Keep radio chatter minimal and meet the threat as a group. But Adair was climbing and still hadn't found his other pilots when he saw shapes in the haze, what looked like 4 aircraft. At first, a small flight line far off to the east. Control stations reported the unknown formation at around 140 mile out, but Adair's eyes didn't agree. As the angle changed and the haze thinned, the illusion collapsed. It wasn't 4 aircraft, it was 4 groups, and behind those groups was more metal than he'd ever seen in one place. By so 9:28, he was high enough to start reading the geometry. Bombers. In the center, arranged in neat V elements with fighters, layered above and below like a moving fence. The count came the only way you can count in a sky full of aircraft, by dividing the formation into sections and estimating each slice. Adair's best judgment, roughly 64 Japanese aircraft. In the bomber stream, about 10 twin-engine bombers, often described as Ki-21 Sally types, escorted by around 40 Ki-43 Oscar fighters. The bombers sat roughly 3,000 feet out beneath him, running about 240 mph on a track that pointed straight toward the airfield complex at Dinjan. And the worst part was the timing. This wasn't a far-off threat. They were already close enough that a clean approach would turn into a bomb release before any distant, friendly fighters could arrive. Adair checked his gauges the way a man checks the straps on a parachute he isn't wearing. Fuel, about 180 gallons. In internal tanks, something like 90 minutes. Of endurance at high power if the engine stayed healthy. Ammunition, 6 bons. 50 caliber Brownings. A terrifying amount of firepower in sound and recoil, yet in cold math, only about 10 to 12 seconds of continuous firing. That meant every burst had to be short, counted, rationed. 1 second, 2 seconds. Stop. A pilot who held the trigger down wasn't brave. He was simply running out of future. The doctrine answer to odds like this was, don't engage. Shadow the raid. Radio for reinforcements. Wait. But doctrine assumes you have time to wait. Adair didn't. A raid of that size didn't need perfect accuracy to wreck an airfield. It needed only a few bombs close enough to crater runway surfaces, ignite fuel, and shatter parked transports. Those transports were the Hump made visible, aircraft that carried supplies over mountains the way blood moves through arteries. Lose them on the ground and you didn't just lose machines. You lost weeks of motion. So Adair made the choice that seems irrational until you understand the clock he was watching. At sign 29, he pushed the throttle forward and climbed above the bomber stream to steal the one advantage a lone fighter can sometimes borrow. Surprise. He eased into position with the sun and haze behind him, not hunting a dogfight, but hunting disruption. Because bombers that can't hold formation can't deliver a clean strike. Bombers forced to scatter drop like gamblers, not like executioners. He rolled and dove. The P-40 accelerated hard in the descent. Tor, 340, 360 mump. The engine note tightening into a strained howl, the airframe buzzing under the pressure. The bomber formation swelled from specks into aircraft, with windows and nacelles and gun positions. Adair waited until the range collapsed to something useful, then tapped the trigger in a short bite. Tracers stitched forward. The first pass didn't have to destroy the raid, it only had to make the formation flinch. And it did. A lead element shifted. A bomber slid out of its tight place. The geometry loosened, just a little. And in bombing, a little can be everything. Then the escort woke up. The Oscars peeled downward from their layers, turning the sky round Adair into a converging problem. The Ki-43 was light and nimble, the kind of fighter that could punish anyone foolish enough to slow down into a turning contest. The P-40's answer was different. Speed, toughness, and refusal to play the enemy's preferred game. Adair didn't try to outcircle them. He used his dive speed and heavy guns in quick slashes, then yanked the Warhawk into a hard pull-up. 6G, 7G, until the edges of his vision tightened and breath became effort. From month 930 to 936. His fight became a brutal rhythm of numbers and choices. How many seconds of trigger time left? How many miles until the bomb line? How many fighters had him bracketed? How long could the engine tolerate full power before heat started doing damage you couldn't see? Each time the bomber stream tried to knit itself back into order, Adair dove again, fired another controlled burst, and forced another break. He wasn't trying to shoot down 24 bombers. He was trying to keep them nervous, scattered, and late. He was trying to turn a sure raid into a messy one. And somewhere in those minutes, he did manage to hurt the formation. He later believed he drove at least one enemy fighter into a fatal spiral that ended in the jungle of the Naga Hills. And his repeated attacks helped keep the bomber stream from holding a clean, confident run. It's important to understand the kind of victory this was. Not a victory you hang on a wall, but the kind where bombs fall wide because a leader jinked at the wrong moment, where a tight V becomes a loose line, where a planned strike turns into a miss measured in miles. If you like stories that run on this kind of minute-by-minute tension, where decisions are counted in seconds and the difference between survival and disaster is a few hundred feet, hit the like button and subscribe right now. It tells me to keep doing deep, detailed narratives like this instead of quick summaries, and it helps the channel reach the people who actually want the long version. Because the most famous part of Adair's morning wasn't even the fight. It was what happened after the fight, when his airplane stopped obeying the rules. Around 9:37 to 9:41. The P-40 started taking hits that mattered. At first it was just sound, sharp metallic impacts like someone striking a drum. Then it was feel. The right side began responding differently. The stick felt soft, then sluggish. The aircraft still flew, but it flew like a machine with severed nerves. A moment later, smoke began creeping into the cockpit. Thin at first, then thicker, scratching his eyes and throat. Adair cracked the canopy to vent it, and the slipstream blasted in, loud enough to flatten thought, cold enough to make his teeth feel exposed. Venting bought him air, but it also reminded him that he was traveling at hundreds of miles an hour, inside something that could turn into a coffin at any second. And then came the moment the war always saves for last, the sense that the battle might be over, but the danger isn't. By 9:43. Adair judged the raid sufficiently disturbed, bombs falling short or wide enough that the heart of the airfield complex wasn't neatly erased, and he turned for home. The distance to Nagaguli, from where he'd been dragged through the fight, was on the order of 40 to 50 miles, often remembered as about 43 miles. The kind of number you repeat in your head until it becomes a rope you hold on to. At roughly 200 pound out of that could be around about 13 minutes. If nothing got worse. Something got worse. The Warhawk grew nose-heavy as if gravity had increased. Holding attitude became labor. One hand wasn't enough. Adair used both, arms tightening, shoulders burning, fighting to keep the nose from sinking. He tried trim. The trim didn't behave like a solution. He tried to rest the stick. There was nothing to rest it against. His body became the control system, human muscle replacing severed cables and damaged linkages. At 9:47, the aircraft dropped into a steepening descent. Altitude unwound fast. 3,000 feet, 2,500, 2,000 Hump. Numbers that shrink frighteningly when your descent rate is running 1,000 to 1,500 feet per minute, and the airspeed is climbing through 200 down B. Adair hauled back and felt that sickening truth. The airplane wasn't answering the way it should. He fought anyway, muscling the nose up just enough to avoid impact. He was not safe. He was simply not dead yet. Somewhere around sign 50. The failure turned brutal and absolute. The right aileron control finally let go in a way that left no room for partial control. The P-40 rolled right and the nose pitched down into another dive. Worse than the first, airspeed surged. 20, 240, 260 AMA, and the jungle became a closing wall. This is where the manuals say, bail out. This is where instructors tell you not to be heroic, because broken controls usually end in a crater. But Adair's altitude was low, his terrain was hostile, and his odds on the ground were not comforting. And in the space of a few seconds, his mind did what minds sometimes do when there's no time left for panic. It searched for a loophole in physics. Aerodynamics doesn't care what you want. It cares what forces exist. A control surface deflected by damage can push the airplane in one direction upright and push it the opposite direction when inverted. A nose-down tendency upright can become nose-up when you flip the whole system upside down. What was killing him right side up might save him upside down. At roughly, 800 feet, Adair rolled the Warhawk completely inverted. Negative G slammed him into his straps. Blood rushed toward his head. The world tinted at the edges. The engine coughed because fuel systems don't like being asked to work upside down while already wounded. For a heartbeat, it felt like the Allison would quit, and the maneuver would simply shorten his death. But it didn't quit. It stumbled and kept running, and the nose, impossibly, came up. The dive slowed. The P-40 leveled inverted around 140 feet, only a narrow margin above stall. He held it inverted as long as the engine would tolerate it, tens of seconds that felt like minutes, then rolled upright briefly to let fuel feed properly and to relieve his body. Upright, the damage immediately tried to shove the nose down again. He waited until he'd lost a few hundred feet. 300 hills. Then rolled inverted again to claw some back. It became a gruesome pattern. Flip and gain a little altitude. Roll upright and lose a little. Flip again. Not a stunt. Not showmanship. A wounded man using a wounded machine as a ladder, rung by rung. From about 9:52 to 10:03. He did that over and over, 11 minutes of alternating orientations, fighting blood rush and nausea, fighting the engine's hunger for fuel in the correct direction, fighting the simple exhaustion of keeping a damaged airplane stable by force of will. Above him, the enemy fighters that had followed watched this bizarre, stubborn survival. An American fighter that should have crashed was instead cycling upright and inverted like something refusing to admit it was beaten. Eventually, the escorts peeled away, whether they ran low on fuel or decided it wasn't worth the risk, or simply concluded the American would die without their help. Adair didn't die. He kept flipping, and then, through haze, he saw Nagaguli. Seeing the runway didn't mean relief. It meant the last problem, the one pilots fear almost as much as combat. Landing a damaged aircraft when systems are failing. Landing gear relied on hydraulic pressure. Hydraulic pressure relied on engine power. Engine power, at this point, was an unreliable friend. Drop the gear too early and drag might pull him short. Wait too long, and the engine might quit before the gear locked. Attempt flaps, and he might not have enough pressure for both. Try a belly landing, and he risked rupturing fuel and turning the cockpit into a torch. He reached for the gear, and got nothing at first. No satisfying whine, no movement. So he went to backup measures, forcing pressure by hand while still fighting the controls. He improvised a crude way to hold the stick near neutral long enough to free both hands, then pumped hard. 10, 15, 20, 25. Each stroke a gamble that the next would matter. Then came the sound that made his chest loosen for the first time in half an hour, the heavy clunk of gear extending. One leg locked, then the other. Instantly the aircraft became draggy and sluggish. Airspeed fell. 60, 45, 35 meters. Still above stall, but close enough that the margin felt like paper. Now the men on the ground saw him. Smoke trailing. Approach odd. Gear down. A fighter arriving in a way that didn't look friendly. In a theater where Japanese raids had been striking bases and where everyone expected deception, the sight triggered the worst reflex. Is that ours? That's how you get the opening scene. The moment, they almost shot him. Adair held the weirdest profile as long as he dared, then at the last possible moment rolled upright, fought the damaged right wing's tendency to drop, fought the nose's desire to fall, and forced the P-40 onto the runway. The touchdown was violent, not graceful. Metal complained. Tires slammed. The aircraft lurched and shuddered as if it wanted to collapse. It skidded and yawed, then finally slowed and stopped. For about 10 seconds. Adair didn't move, not because he was dead, but because his body was catching up to the last 35 minutes of heat, smoke, strain, and terror. Then he unlatched, climbed out onto the wing, and nearly folded at the knees as hands reached up to pull him down. Only after that did the wider consequences start to appear, because Dinjan wasn't just saved or not saved in one clean line. War is rarely clean, but the raid had not landed the kind of neat, concentrated blow it was designed to deliver. Bombs fell short or scattered. The airfield complex did not become a single massive fire. Transports that could have been reduced to burning wrecks remained available to fly. Fuel stocks were not all erased. Runway capacity wasn't guaranteed to be cratered beyond use. The supply chain, already bleeding from weather losses and constant strain, was not snapped in one morning, and that mattered far beyond one airfield. The Hump airlift ran from 1942 through 1945, and by the end it would deliver hundreds of thousands of tons of supplies into China at a terrifying cost, around 594 aircraft lost, and roughly 1,659 airmen killed or missing. That's not a single battle. That's a slow, grinding tragedy measured in storms, navigation errors, icing, mechanical failures, and the occasional violent punctuation of enemy action. Every time an Assam base stayed operational after a raid, the airlift stayed alive. Every time the airlift stayed alive, entire fronts downstream had a chance to keep fighting. December 1943 was a turning period in the larger campaign. The Allies were building strength for deeper operations in Burma, working toward reopening land routes and pushing Japanese forces back. The airlift and the Assam bases were part of that preparation, part of the long, unglamorous work that makes later offensives possible. In that sense, Adair's morning sits inside a chain. Keep the bases running, keep the transports flying, keep the tonnage moving, keep the pressure steady, until the war's center of gravity shifts. Later, the airlift would reach astonishing monthly totals, and the CBI theater's tempo would climb. Those numbers didn't appear from nowhere. They were built out of mornings like this. Mornings when a raid could have knocked the system sideways, and didn't. The story also didn't end for the people in the air. Other pilots would get airborne and fight their own battles. At least one friendly pilot, Lieutenant would be forced to bail out after being shot up, suffering burns and surviving. Another reminder that even a successful day takes its payment. Adair's own aircraft needed days of work. His arms needed days to stop aching from wrestling a fighter that wanted to bury its nose into the jungle. And Adair himself carried the mental residue that doesn't show up in mission summaries. The memory of the windshield filling with green. The moment he realized the controls were no longer connected to his will. The sensation of hanging, inverted while the engine coughed and the blood rushed to his skull. In the months that followed, Adair kept flying. He'd go on to rack up far more missions than most people can imagine, eventually achieving ace status and later remaining in the Air Force for decades, retiring as a colonel in 1971. That long arc, surviving combat, surviving the war, then living a whole career, makes the December 13th mission feel even stranger, because it reminds you how thin the line is between a future and vanishing. If the Warhawk had hit the trees at 1,800 feet, if the engine had quit inverted, if the gunners had squeezed the trigger at Nagaguli, Adair wouldn't have had a later career, and the story wouldn't exist. The war would have swallowed him the way it swallowed so many others. Quietly, quickly, with no cinematic ending. And that's the heart of why this episode still matters. It isn't just one pilot versus 64 aircraft. It's one pilot discovering, in real time, under smoke and damage and exhaustion, that procedure is not the same as physics. A manual can tell you what normally happens. It can't tell you what to do when your aircraft becomes a broken system and the ground is rising. In those moments, surviving isn't about being fearless. It's about being functional while terrified, doing math while your arms are failing, making choices while your lungs are breathing poison, forcing the airplane into an attitude that hurts your body because it buys you 15 more seconds of altitude. So when you picture that opening moment again, the inverted P-40 arriving with gear down, men on the ground nearly firing, smoke trailing through the haze, don't picture a stunt. Picture the last step of an hour that compressed into 35 minutes. Of deadlines. 9:27. The formation appears. 9:29. The first dive. 9:43. The break for home. 9:50. The control failure. 9:52. The first inverted recovery. 10:22 toward the airfield finally in sight, and then the landing that had to happen on a system that was barely alive. If you want more stories like this, stories where the outcome is decided by minutes, distances, altitude bands, and a human brain improvising under combat stress, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. And leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, or whether anyone in your family served in the China-Burma-India theater, or flew the Hump. Because some fronts get remembered by monuments. Others only get remembered if we keep telling the stories, down to the numbers, down to the seconds, until they feel real again.